Hello, my name is Jake Rupert, and this is my client assessment on Olivia Benner. Olivia is a former lacrosse and field hockey student at King's College. We're going to start off with Olivia's static posture from the anterior view. The static postural assessment focuses on the kinetic checkpoints: the foot, the ankle, the knee, the lumbopelvic hip complex, the shoulder, and the cervical spine. When we start from the feet and we go from the ground up, we want to make sure that the feet are pointed straight and that they are underneath the knees about shoulder width apart. There's no problems here as Olivia has pretty straight feet. Next, we move up to the knees. When we look at the knees of Olivia, we can see that they bend in slightly, telling us that they are valgus. This can have some implications, especially for an athlete, and knee problems and hip problems. Her hips are also slightly uneven, as her right hip is slightly higher than her left hip. We don't notice any rounding in her shoulders, and we can really focus on that in the next slide especially. Moving on to the lateral view of Olivia's static posture. As I just mentioned, there's not much rounding of the shoulders. She has a pretty open chest, indicating that she does not have upper cross syndrome, and she doesn't have too much forward head tilt. However, I will say that she does have a lorotic curve that is pretty significant, and this can ultimately lead to lower back pain. As we look at the static posture posterior view, and we look at the checkpoints in Olivia, her feet look okay and her hips look okay in this view. However, you can see that she definitely has valgus knees as they cave inward, as we assessed in the anterior view. You can also see that her left shoulder hangs lower than her right shoulder, and her right shoulder is slightly elevated in comparison to the left. This may be to a tight levator scap or a tight upper trap on the right and a weaker one on the left. For the overhead squat from the anterior view, we're looking for feet to be shoulder width apart, toes pointed straight, arms overhead with the elbows fully extended, and the upper arm should be in line with the ears.
Go down.
As you can see, Olivia slightly points her feet outward. This is not something that we noticed in the static assessment, but we do notice in the overhead squat assessment. This may be due to some ankle mobility issues and tightness in the gastroc. Additionally, we do see her knees start to cave in. This could be due to overactive adductors and a weak glute med or TFL. So we now move on to the overhead squat lateral view. Before even viewing the video, you can see some problems with Olivia's overhead squat. You can see that her arms are not in line with her ears anymore when she is down in her squat position. This is indicative of tight lats. Along with this, she has a slight lorotic curve in her low back. This can be indicative of a tight erector spinae or tight lats once again. And then finally, her hips are extremely flexed in this position and her
Do one more
chest is
from the
almost
side,
pointed
please.
down at the ground. This could be because of tight hips, tight hip flexors. Let's view the video now. So as Olivia gets down into her squat, her arms come significantly forward. As we go back. You can see how far forward her arms come, but
Do
at the
one more from the
top,
side.
they're back in line with her ears. So this is very indicative of tight lats. Finally, let's take a look at the overhead squat posterior view. From this view, it is once again very apparent that she has a lot of forward lean. However, that is not the goal of the posterior view, so we're going to more so focus on the knees and the feet here. You can see her knees start to cave in once again, indicating tight adductors. And then we also see her feet are pointed out, as we saw in the first video. This again is probably due to a lack of ankle mobility. We now move on to the single leg squat. For the single leg squat, the hands should be on the hips. The feet should be pointed straight ahead, and the ankle, knee, and lumbopelvic hip complex should all be in a neutral position.
Other side.
In this video, as you can tell, Olivia does not keep her hands on her hips. She tried multiple
Other side.
repetitions with her hands on her hips, but continued to stick her hands straight out to try and give herself a new center of gravity. This is due to a lack of stabilization and a lack of balance. Additionally, you can see that Olivia's knee sways inward and outward. This can be due to an overactive adductor complex, biceps femoris, or TFL. Uh, Possibly what could be underactive for her here is her medial hamstring, her medial gastroc, her glute med, or her glute max. So in this video, everything that you just saw in Olivia's right foot and her right leg when trying to do the single leg squat, you can see exaggerated even more when she does it on her left foot.
Your knees can go over your shins.
So once again, she's sticking her hands out pretty far here. She's getting a little bit less depth on this side,
Your
and
knees
that
can
is
go over your
most likely
shins.
because she's unable to keep herself balanced. Finally, I'd like to point out that her knee instability has gotten far worse on the left side than it was on the right side. This could be due to an overactive adductor complex, biceps femoris, TFL, or lateral gastrocnemius. The probable underactive muscles in this example are the medial hamstring, the medial gastroc, or the glute med/glute max. We now move on to the dorsiflexion test of the right foot. The goal of this is to stand facing a wall in a standing position with one foot flat, with the toes just a few inches away from the wall. In this example, I have Olivia's feet at 3 inches from the wall. She was directed to slowly drive her front knee forward to the wall without lifting the heel. If this is done, then she passes the test.
Wait, hold on. Wait, hold on.
Nice and slow.
So in this example, Olivia does do the test a little bit faster than desired. She also is unable to reach her knee to the wall. She also compensates for not being able to touch her knee to the wall by shifting her entire body and her entire center of mass towards the wall. This is very indicative of a lack of ankle mobility and a tight gastrocnemius and an underactive tib anterior. A lot of the same observations can be made here with Olivia's left foot.
Just your knee. Okay.
That.
Once again, she
Just
is
your knee.
trying to
Okay.
move all of her body weight towards that wall so that she can touch her knee to the wall. However, she's still struggling to get the knee to the wall and really shows poor ankle mobility. Next, we move on to the modified Thomas test. This test assesses hip extension, hip abduction, and knee flexion. In this example, Olivia's thigh is elevated above the table, and her hip is not fully extended. This indicates to us that she has a tight hip flexor, either a tight iliopsoas or rec fem. If you look to the image on the right, you can also see that her right leg is slightly abducted to the left. This indicates to us that she may have tightness in her TFL or her glute med. As we look at the modified Thomas test on the left leg, we can see that her hip is still not very extended, which indicates that she also has a tight hip flexor on her left side. Contrary to the right side, her leg is a little bit less abducted on this side, which suggests that maybe she doesn't have a tight TFL or a glute med on the left side. We now move on to our first dynamic assessment. In this video, we're going to assess Olivia's gait from the anterior view.
Go ahead.
One of our checkpoints, as mentioned earlier, was the lumbopelvic hip complex. You can see that she has some hip hikes in this complex as her hips sway from side to side. This can be an indicator of an overactive quadratus lumborum, or TFL. Could also mean an underactive adductor complex or glute med.
Okay.
In the lateral view of Olivia's gait, we see a little bit of low back arch, which indicates hip
Okay.
flexor tightness, erector spinae tightness, or latissimus dorsi tightness. We mentioned this earlier when we also saw her in her static assessment. She also may suffer from underactive glute max, intrinsic core stabilizers, or hamstrings. Finally, let's take a look at the posterior view of Olivia's gait. The posterior view shows a really exaggerated version of the hip hikes that she struggles from. We saw these in the anterior view, but they really are exaggerated from this view. Finally, we are going to move on to the Davies test. The Davies test is a pretty difficult dynamic test that focuses a lot on core stabilization and muscles like the pec major. In this test, Olivia is supposed to tap each hand as many times as she can in 15 seconds. Unfortunately, we messed up this test and Olivia is tapping her shoulders. Due to how hard this was, her hands are not 36 inches apart and they're slightly outside of shoulder width, along with her feet, to try and make a more reasonable center of mass for her.
Ready?
Yep. Okay.
Although this test was not done correctly, you can see that Olivia sways much more when leaning to her left side, indicating that her left side and her left stabilizers are much weaker than those on the right.
Ready?
Yep.
Here is another view of Olivia's Davies test. This view really shows just how wide her feet were to try and help her stabilize herself. This view also gives us a better view of her scapula. As you can see her here, she is leaning significantly to her left, as I mentioned in the previous video. You can also see some scapular winging here, which is a telltale sign of a weak serratus anterior.